Tristan, thank you so much indeed for a truly inspiring walk through museums. So we do have time for questions. So if you would like to pose a question to Tristan, please raise your hand and we'll throw some microphones your way. Could we have the lady over here first, please?
I suspect, like many scientists, I get massively frustrated when media questions about science in programs like University Challenge are basically history. Who did what, when, not the how. What do you think the role of museums could be in linking what's happened in the past, what's happening in the present, and what might happen in the future be in terms of science education?
I mean, my colleague Ian Blatchford at the Science Museum would be much better positioned to answer that. But what we found with our exhibition at the moment, The Future Starts Here, which Ian said should be in my museum, is in a sense providing the social and civic context to some of those challenging scientific issues, and in a sense making what at one strand could be a quite technical conversation to making it in a sense a much more political conversation about the ramifications of science, the kind of the democracy of science, teasing out the politics and the sociology of it. How we then put that in a kind of lineage in terms of the development of science. We're very good at doing that in terms of art and design at the V&A, and I've seen some wonderful exhibitions at the Science Museum doing the same. But I think it is more challenging because what we have is the wonder of these objects, and looking at, it is on the one hand that I think science has an advantage in terms of contemporary displays, and the Natural History Museum has an incredible advantage on that. But being able to tell the story through the wonder of the object through the past, going back to that incredible, piece of Japanese ceramics from 2000 BC gives us a competitive advantage there. So I think it's the ability of science to think about telling it through the wonder of the object in a sense and not being afraid of that so much. I think we have much more to learn about how you have that in a contemporary setting and make it more urgent. We look in envy at the kind of 10 and 11 and 12-year-olds queuing up at the Science Museum and Natural History Museum. This is why we built this new courtyard, so they come across. They get bored of queuing after 40 minutes, and we say, oh, come on, come and see some jewelry.
Can we ask Hank, please?
That was a very thoughtful, intelligent, and amusing speech. Thank you.
Thank you.
I agree with you about museums and their important role, but I don't know whether you've noticed or other people have noticed that in this country there is no National Museum of Education. In almost every other advanced industrial country in the world, there is one. And I'll be grateful for your thoughts on why that is so. And I'd also say that I'm involved in education. We finally decided to set one up. It's a registered charity. So if you've got any line or two about any advice, I'd be very grateful. But I think that's a very interesting point that we never had that. And why is that? And hopefully we're going to change it and add to the brilliant museums we've got around in this country. Thank you.
I think that's a great point, and I hadn't thought of that before at all. I mean, I think the challenge is always how the collections are dispersed. You might remember, Ken Baker 10 years ago he felt, we have a British museum, but we have no museum of British history. And there was this terrifying moment when there was going to be established a Museum of British History, which would then kind of take the bits it wanted from the V&A and the Natural History Museum and the British Museum, and thankfully it was kind of suffocated. But you could, for example, the Museum of London has incredible accounts of education within London, museums in Manchester. And I mean, I think you find at the moment the story of education either connected to university museums and institutions or connected to civic and urban museums. But you're right, telling the story of, as it were, having that kind of that line of march and having that analytical approach, which the particular subject of a museum will bring to it, opens up incredibly new avenues. And we will be delighted to lend to your new Museum of Education.
Great. We're going to move up to the gallery. Can we take the lady? The lights are very difficult. Oh, there we go.
Hi. As someone who works in museums currently, I'm overwhelmingly, and I work in education in museums, particularly in science museums. Whilst the people who come and visit from schools, particularly in London, are children of colour, and they come in families from people of colour backgrounds who are not traditionally represented in museums, what are you doing, and what can people in other museums do to change the types of people who are choosing the stories that we tell, choosing the exhibitions that we're putting on, and also encouraging people of colour and people of other marginalised backgrounds, be that people of disability, people of queerness, or still quite a lot of women when it comes to science. Thank you for your question about science earlier. What are you doing to encourage those other stories and make those museums a place for those people as well?
Great question. I mean, and you're absolutely right on the kind of disparity. 47% of school groups who come to the V&A, the children in those school groups, 47% are from black and minority ethnic backgrounds, which is impressive and good and what we should be doing. It also tells me actually we're probably not getting enough children from outside London coming to the V&A who will have a different makeup. But your point about the voice and the control of the narrative is very powerful. And we know there are big challenges, and you've mentioned gender and sexuality and ethnicity, but also I'd say socioeconomic class in terms of the makeup of the museum body. It's a long old process, and what you have to do, it seems to me, it operates at a number of levels. One is to make the museum as accessible as possible. We were criticized recently that the new uniforms at the V&A looked like B&Q or Sainsbury's. And A, they don't, but B, I felt, well, I don't really have a problem with that because everyone feels they have a right to go into Sainsbury's or B&Q. They don't feel they have to ask permission to go into those spaces. And the more we make museums, without losing an inch of curatorial integrity and rigor, as accessible and open as possible, which means that people feel they belong there, which means that people think their children belong there, which means that people think their children could build careers and jobs there. So I think making our museums as open and as accessible, which our new entrance does as well, is very, very important. We then have to think about the long term, and yes, it's the connection with schools and education, but one of the reasons we're very passionate about going into Stratford and the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park is that we are going to be investing in those schools and those sixth form colleges and those universities to build a curatorial pipeline for the future. And that might take 5 years and 10 years and 15 years, but if we're invested in those communities, what we want to do is talent spot and grow talent from an incredibly diverse part of London, which is growing incredibly fast, and it's very, very young. So I think we need investment in there for the long term. And we also, you just need those things about total transparency around appointment process and all the rest of it. We have to make sure, though, and this goes back to what we're doing around education, is that parents, and particularly parents of more challenged socioeconomic background, parents from ethnic minorities, think that art and design and creativity is for their children and will provide good careers in the long run. And that's a kind of step change in thinking about the value of these subjects. So it's a long old job which we're all going to be involved with.
Tristram, I'm going to ask a question myself now. You shared something with me earlier, which I think is rather important. But if we're going to make museums places where we can actually learn about the future by the recent past, as a result of, for example, the Fashion Week and everything that you've been talking about, of new technology being showcased in places like the V&A, the pace of acceleration of new technology being adopted is greater, and therefore the challenge gets even bigger for you to keep on top of recent history. You're not being supported by our lovely government in terms of the amount of funding that you said you're getting from central government. So much as you've got Dundee being done, etc. Frankly, the funding you get from government is actually diminishing. What can we do as museums nationally to lay the challenge at the government's feet to say, actually, the relevance of museums today is so important and the challenge is getting even bigger?
I mean, we've had a 30% cut in real terms in our budget since 2010 in terms of government support. But we're doing what we're being asked to do, and we're seeking to do more and more. I think British museums are going to fall behind their continental colleagues fairly soon. You know, Berlin is just opening the £600 million Humboldt Forum. Our colleagues at the Smithsonian are redoing the Air and Space Museum, a $900 million refurb. There's just a level of capital investment in cultural infrastructure around the world which we are not keeping up with. I don't see any change in that, frankly, from government in the near future. My big kind of passion and bugbear is to ask central government to allow local authority leaders and mayors to levy a tourist tax or a hotel tax. 4 out of 5 tourists come to London for visiting for culture, for cultural purposes. And yet cultural institutions, because we don't charge, receive small amounts of that. And it seems to me if we want to keep the museums free, which I do, then the Mayor of London should have the freedom to levy a tourist tax. Where my plan falls down is that if the Mayor of London then levies a tourist tax, there's no certainty it'll come to big national museums. It'll go to dance troupes in Bexley or something, which need the money, I'm sure. But I do think we need new sources for, you know, if we're getting these numbers, if we're doing this work around the world, we need new sources of income. And it seems to me a hotel tax is not a bad place to start.
And we would be the first people to do it. Right, next question. The lady at the very back, please.
Hi. Just to follow on from the lady upstairs and her questions. Obviously, in terms of improving national museums' inclusivity for different and marginalised groups in society, so not just, I mean, non-white people, people of different sexual orientations, etc., obviously, you talked a lot about the education side of things, which is essential, thinking about training programs for the future and trying to inspire future generations and parents of younger generations to encourage art and creativity. However, museums are not neutral spaces, are they? And don't you think that there is another half of that where we have to kind of redress the balance of kind of explaining why certain things have been included in national museums to date? So explaining the absence of female artists or female scientists, or, you know, you get my point.
No, I do. And it's a question of priorities. If I think what my priorities are, and these aren't, you know, it's not zero sum, because we can and should be able to do both. But if I think of trying to inspire the children of my former constituents in Stoke-on-Trent to become designers by getting objects at the Pottery Museum, working with the teachers in the schools at Disley Hough and elsewhere to go back to that kind of 1851 vision about ingenuity and imagination. If we can do that as an institution, then that's, I think, a really positive and powerful step. At the same time, we have to be alert. You're absolutely right. Museums are not neutral. You know, we make decisions every day about what we show. And for the V&A as a museum born of the imperial moment, born of the colonial moment, we have a particular responsibility to be very open, it seems to me, about the origins of our South Asia collection and our East Asia collection, and be clearer about how they came into the South Kensington Museum, and to be open about that. So you're totally right. We need to be totally transparent about that. But in terms of we have to balance that with our kind of 30% cut about prioritization. And I think there's a balance between a kind of often a sort of internal museological discussion and the real world of a total collapse in the number of young people taking art and design. And I see my job, these aren't, you know, you can't do one without, you don't need to do one and not the other. But I see a kind of powerful calling for the V&A to address the collapse in art and design, as well as be engaged in some of those museological conversations.
Okay, next question. Right up at the very top.
Yeah, Tristram, thank you for a really entertaining talk. It was a lot better, I must say, than I expected. Even you did read a bit from a script, I have to say, and it was somewhat self-serving. But my question, you just mentioned about
I hate it to be bad.
You're trying to inspire young people into art and design and science. We've had falling numbers of students entering university for the past 5 or 6 years. Now, and you showed a nice slide showing the fall in the number of people doing GCSEs in the arts. What's another reason for that? 3 words, university tuition fees. And remember who introduced them in the first place? Your government in 2004. And at the time, I said this would lead to US-style fees within a decade. And I was laughed at by people in your party. So this has come back to haunt me. I love rubbing it into them now. So I think one of the big barriers to people wanting to do these courses is lack of jobs, lack of well-paid jobs. And that's why they're focusing on jobs like in the financial sector that almost reap instant reward in terms of pay. So
what's the question?
Basically, do you feel somewhat responsible for basically creating your own problem? Because I think you should, personally.
I don't. I believe in university tuition fees.
How high should they be? 9 grand, 10 grand?
I'm going to answer now. It's not going to be a conversation. So I believe in university tuition fees. I believe, and we've just actually reached 50% of young people going to university, which was the great Tony Blair's vision. And I believe they should make a contribution. But actually, because I'm now a civil servant, I have no party political views, but it is a matter of record that I voted against a number of times. It was a long night. The increase in tuition fees from 3,000 to 9 and further. So I certainly believe that tuition fees are too high in this country, which is why I voted against them. But I also believe that students should contribute to the price of universities. And actually, I think we've seen a marked, I mean, this won't be popular either, but if you look at the pay of curators relative to university lecturers, whereas previously they were on a relative par, actually in the last 10 years, there's been a marked increase in remuneration for university personnel compared to museum personnel. And don't even get me started on vice-chancellors.
Oh, yes.
A beautifully balanced answer, Tristan, I must say. We have time for one more question. Could I take the gentleman in the middle here, please? Do we have a microphone? Thank you, Charlotte.
Thank you. I felt, coming back to museums, that the concept of museums of any type, engineering, science, arts, in the broadest sense, should, in fact, cooperate. They are, at the moment, many of the local museums are strictly parochial, even when they're quite substantial museums. They don't look outside their own collections. And as you say, the biggest and most important thing that any museum curator can do is to conserve the collections he has.
So do you have is there a question?
I will
Are
agree.
you going to respond?
I will agree about the obligation of maintaining the collections and the importance of it, and also the importance of sharing, so that we can have this last question from that lady, if that's okay.
Take mine.
So I wasn't originally going to add this to the question, but as someone who's just sent off my university application today, so I am thinking about university fees quite closely, and actually I do agree that we should be paying a little bit for university. The thing I've noticed is, looking at degrees people are taking, is actually a sort of movement of anti-intellectualism, this idea that this polarized society where you've got the sort of almost metrosexual hyper-intellectuals, and then, as you were saying, with sort of fake news, this idea that we should be moving, there's a movement of going away from things like museums and theatre and arts. And as a modern museum, looking, I'm sure you know there's something you're interested in. How do you offer your sort of museum to a wide audience in a world where there's a movement of going deliberately against what you almost stand for?
We don't. Is this a kind of double negative? There's no platforming at the V&A. We are a shared civic space. We like this phrase of a kind of safe space for unsafe ideas. So it is a trusted environment, and we try and bring in as many voices as possible. And they won't be as diverse as some colleagues would like, but we can always do more on that. But I do think that, and it worries me about university space, which becomes more and more partisan and polarized and anti-intellectual in some spaces. Actually, museums have a more important role as this kind of civic exchange. And thankfully, we don't have some of the bureaucracy which universities suffer at the moment. And so we have this wonderful zone where we can have these debates inspired by the wonderful surroundings of the architecture and the great objects, which we will continue to care for.
So Tristan, I'd just like to conclude with a short remark, really, and that is you have done a beautiful job this evening of eloquently explaining actually why there is this merging. There are no barriers between engineering and science. There are no barriers, really, between art and science. In fact, if we're going to develop our world, and we need creative innovators, we don't just need those who understand how things work. We need to understand the broader sense of why you might want it to work in the first place and what it might look like. And with my director of the Royal Institution hat on, I look forward very much indeed to actually signposting people to the V&A as well as to the Science Museum. I've already met with Ian to go and do likewise. And I think a more unified cross-collaboration across all of the, certainly the museums that are in London, so that in terms of access, but beyond the field of London as well. So thank you ever so much indeed for a very rich talk this evening.
Thank you. Thank you.